Good morning, and welcome to the Austin chapter of Reasons to Believe. I'm John Murphy. I currently serve as the president of the Austin chapter. I really do appreciate everyone joining us today, both here live and also people watching via YouTube Live. So please bow with me as we open with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time that we can get together and we can learn more about you, and even in such a difficult and trying time, help us to appreciate the tremendous number of blessings that we get to enjoy on a daily basis. Every breath, every day, every relationship, every person to love, all the friendships that we have, the ability to worship you, the opportunity to learn more about you as we hopefully can in this presentation. Please help us that as we learn more about your awesome wonder, and as we use this as a form of study and a form of love in trying to get to know you better, that we can be that light or that beacon unto you as we go out into our workplaces and visit with our families and our neighbors. And these things we ask. In Jesus' name, amen. So last month we were very fortunate to have Dr. Sarah Salviander come and speak, and she talked about the book of Genesis, specifically looking at Genesis chapter 1. And that presentation is available on YouTube Live, and so I presume if you're watching this, you know how to get to our channel. This is just a reminder to please subscribe to this channel. That time, anytime we have a new video coming up, and we do intend to add more and more content, then you will be notified. So next month, very excited to have Dr. Brandon Riddell, who works at NASA, to come and speak at our chapter. Dr. Riddell is actually the president of the Houston chapter of Reasons to Believe, and he's going to talk to us about the International Space Station. Now, I don't know what sort of Christian apologetic value this is going to have, but it's going to be very educational, and one thing that you learn is that all truth is God's truth, and as you learn more and more truth, you learn more and more about God. He's going to talk to us about the International Space Station and what its mission and its purpose is. He's going to talk about some current studies that are ongoing in their search for dark matter as well as antimatter. And so please set your calendar. We'll return to the second Saturday of November the 14th at 10 a.m. as usual. And then in December, also very excited to have Jay Mendenwalt come to speak. He's currently a doctoral student at Baylor University, and his subject is going to be very interesting. I don't believe we've had a presentation on the subject of sex here yet. I imagine that this will be a great presentation actually to invite any of your middle school or high school students. He's going to be looking at the biblical model of monogamous heterosexual relationships and see whether there are any scientific studies that actually back up whether this is a good model for our sexual relations, or if it's no different than any other sexual relations that people may choose. So again, December, I'm expecting to have probably a higher viewership in December due to the subject, actually. And then in January, I'll be speaking again, and I'm very excited about this presentation. I've spent a lot of time doing research and getting prepared for it. So this is going to be part one of a two-part series. The series is called Prayer in Miracles, and part one, we're going to look at the question, does prayer work? And that's a very interesting question that depends on how you define two of those words, prayer and work. What does it mean for prayer to work? And so we're going to be looking at a lot of scientific studies in that presentation as well. So normally, I would encourage people to make a note of this email address and to be prepared to send in your questions at the end, but this is going to be a long presentation as I'm about to discuss, and so we're really not going to have much time for questions. I did receive one question via email this week, which I will address at the very end of the presentation because it's a very good one, and I would like to respond to that. So at this time, you can just relax and hopefully enjoy this presentation. So in 1996, Dr. Hugh Ross published his book, Beyond the Cosmos. And it was a few years after that when I got around to ordering and reading the book. And as I began to read the book, I was having a really difficult time understanding the theological concepts that he was discussing. Now, this would have been about 20 years ago when I was in my mid-30s, and as I continued to read further, I got about 1/3 of the way through the book, and I was not enjoying it at all. And I wasn't enjoying it because I wasn't understanding it, and I felt dumb, to be candid with you. And so I, somewhat embarrassed, I took that book and I just put it back on my shelf and said, maybe one day, maybe I'll grow up and I'll mature and I'll be able to understand it. Well, fast forward a little bit, and I often watch educational materials on the treadmill, and so I was running out of things to watch, and I went to the RTB website and ordered all the DVDs that they had that I did not already have. And 20 years ago, the library was much smaller, so it was really only a handful of DVDs that I ordered. But one of those was The Elegant Universe, which is a PBS Nova series. And I finally got around to watching it, and when I watched it, I loved it. To this day, it is my all-time favorite science-based documentary, and it's a 3-part series with 3 one-hour episodes. But as I got to the end of it, I remembered that I had ordered this through RTB, but I wondered why. Why is RTB selling this? It's a completely secular DVD. I didn't see anything specifically related to RTB. Didn't see anything was obviously of a Christian apologetic value. So I decided to go back to the RTB website and pull it up and read the description, and it was very interesting because the description said, for those of you that are having a difficult time understanding or comprehending Dr. Ross's book, Beyond the Cosmos, this DVD may help to set a foundation of knowledge to help you better understand the theology that is discussed in the book. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So very shortly after that, I went back, I grabbed that book, I started to read it, and this time it was a page-turner. This time I enjoyed it thoroughly. I was involved deeply into the subject matter. I thought that it was explained very clearly. I was wondering, why didn't I see this before? It seemed so obviously plain. I could not understand why I didn't see it or comprehend it before. And I think it's another good example of how knowledge builds upon knowledge. And I do think that watching that DVD helped me to better understand the book, and that has influenced the way that I have taught this series. And so the first time I presented this series was in my Sunday school class, and we made it a 3-week series. So the first week we watched episode 1 of the DVD, and then people watched episodes 2 and 3 at home. The second week, we talked about dimensions and extra-dimensionality, and then the third week, we talked about the theology of string theory. Well, 3 weeks is hard for people to commit to, and invariably, very few people were able to make all 3 weeks. So the next time I taught it, I decided to cut it down to a 2-week series, and so everybody was encouraged to watch the DVD at home. The first week, we talked about dimensions, and we talked about extra-dimensionality. The second week, we talked about the theological concepts. Once again, probably half the people could only make one part of the series or the other. And the problem with that is if you went to the first lecture, well, then you missed the whole point of the series. If you miss the second, which is the theology, you miss the whole point of it. And if you miss the first one, but then you came for the theology, a lot of people were confused and they didn't understand, similar to the way I was when I first read the book. So what I have decided to do the last couple of times I've given this presentation is just simply combine those two into one, which makes this a longer presentation than normal. This is effectively going to be 2 presentations, and that's why we're not going to have time to take questions at the end. And so if you are wondering why this is going on and on, okay, I want to tell you this is why, because the foundational knowledge we do in the beginning is going to be very important when we get to the theology. So at the turn of the 20th century, most scientists believed that the universe was infinite in size and that it was eternal. that it had existed forever. Its existence was just simply accepted as a brute fact. You just accepted that it existed. There's no reason to even study why it came into existence because it's always been existence. However, Einstein's theory of general relativity yielded the surprising result that the universe was expanding. And if you rewind the expansion of the universe, then the implications were that the universe must have had a beginning. Now, this was unsettling to Einstein's own worldview, and initially it caused him to reject it. However, by 1929, Edwin Hubble was able to visibly detect that galaxies were moving apart and confirm that the universe was expanding. From 1966 to 1970, Stephen Hawking, George Ellis, and Roger Penrose extended the equations of general relativity to also include space and time. And so their papers showed that space and time must also have a beginning that was coincident for that of all matter and energy. So in other words, their papers showed that if general relativity accurately describes the physics of the universe, then all matter, energy, space, and even time itself share a singular origin at some finite time in the past. Now, many Christians misunderstand the Big Bang or Big Bang cosmology or Big Bang theory. They think that it's some sort of a naturalistic attempt to get by God, to bypass God, and explain the origin of the universe. However, that is a complete misunderstanding, and it's actually a false understanding. The Big Bang cosmology is the scientific theory and the verification thereof that the universe came into existence and that it had a beginning whereby all matter, energy, space, and even time itself began to exist in one singular explosive creation event. It scientifically suggests that once there was nothing and then poof or bang, there was all matter, energy, space, and time. Now, what caused this to happen is still very much open to speculation. And so the portion of the Elegant Universe DVD that attempts to show how string theory might be able to shed some light on Big Bang cosmology very much affirms this. So the host, Brian Greene, he introduces that segment with this confession. He notes, there's always been a couple of problems with the Big Bang theory. First, when you go back to the bang, the laws of physics break down. They just don't make any sense anymore. And on top of this, there is the bang itself. What exactly is that? And then laughing and noticeably uncomfortable, MIT physicist Alan Guth adds, well, that's actually a problem. Classic form of the Big Bang theory really says nothing about what banged, what happened before it banged, or what caused it to bang. In addition, you have Bert Everett, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he talks about this idea of getting something from nothing. He notes, well, I don't know about you, but I don't like nothing. Do I really believe that the universe was a big bang out of nothing? And I'm not a philosopher, so I won't say, but I can imagine to a philosopher that is a problem. But to a physicist, I think it is also a problem. This creation event, which is often referred to as the singularity event or the singularity problem, and it's considered a problem from a naturalistic perspective because it is genuinely difficult to explain how you get something, or literally everything in this universe, from nothing. Now, many scientists are currently working on alternative theories in an effort to try and eliminate that singularity, but Alan Guth from MIT confesses that all of these at this time is nothing more than just speculation squared. Now, despite the widespread credit that's been given to Stephen Hawking and George Ellis and Einstein for the formulation and the discovery of the Big Bang, Bible scholars will point out that Moses, the Apostle Paul, and the author of Hebrews declared it first. Genesis 1:1 boldly proclaims, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the Hebrew verb bara is translated here as created, and it suggests the origin of something totally new, something which did not previously exist or that was previously undetectable. Now in the Bible, that Hebrew verb bara is only used in regard to the creative activity of God. It's God's verb, if you will. And historically, the church has understood this to be the creation of something from nothing, creation ex nihilo, you will often hear. Now, the Apostle Paul also refers to this grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. Elsewhere, he refers to a faith and knowledge resting on the hope of eternal life, which God, who does not lie, promised before the beginning of time. These Bible verses declare that the timeline of our universe had a beginning, that God existed outside the timeline of our universe, and that God was engaged in cause and effect behavior before the beginning of our universe. The author of Hebrews further elaborates, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. To paraphrase, the cosmos we can detect came from beyond our ability to detect. These Bible verses declare that God created all the matter, energy, time, and space of this universe, that everything in this universe was created by God, and that God exists outside of this universe, and that he was engaging in cause and effect behavior before this universe existed. So the agnostic astrophysicist Robert Jastrow, he wrote a really good book giving the history of Big Bang Theory and also the scientific evidence on behalf of it. And in his book, he summarizes at the very end, astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace every star, every planet, and every living thing in the cosmos and on earth, and they have found that all of this has happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Now again, logically, if God can create space and time, then he must exist outside of space and time. If he can create space and time, then he can certainly create more space and time than the 4 dimensions of space and time we currently experience. We currently experience 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. Furthermore, if that's true, then God would have access to an unlimited amount of space-time in order to accomplish anything or any part of his will. And so when we begin to recognize and start thinking about these extra space-time dimensions and what sort of capabilities that gives God, it will help to open our minds to possibly solve some of these biblical paradoxes that theologians and scholars have struggled with for millennia. During an interview in the 2009 issue of Christianity Today, the reporter Mark Galli was interviewing Dinesh D'Souza, and he asked him this question: how might science explain heaven and hell as places that could exist? And D'Souza responded, scientists now posit through string theory the presence of multiple realms, multiple dimensions. One of the implications of the Big Bang is that space and time had a beginning, and that space and time are properties of the universe. The idea that our universe may not be the only one, and that there may be other universes operating according to different laws, is now coming into mainstream physics. So the Christian concept of eternity, which is God outside of space and time, is rendered completely intelligible. It opens up possibilities that would have seemed far-fetched even for science fiction a century ago. So, string theory in a nutshell. In the 1970s, when I was a child, I thought that the atom was the smallest known particle that we were aware of at the time, but that was not correct. We had already split the atom, and we knew that the atom consisted of electrons, protons, and neutrons. However, in the 1970s, we were just beginning to advance in particle physics, and so we were starting to learn that protons and neutrons were actually made up of smaller point particles called quarks. Now, string theory is suggesting that quarks and electrons may not be the smallest particles, but they, and in fact everything in the universe, may be made up of these little tiny vibrating loops of energy called strings. And to give you an idea of how infinitesimally these strings might be, the Elegant Universe notes that if a single atom was the size of our solar system, then one string would be the size of one tree here on planet Earth. So let me repeat that so you can visualize how small that is. If a single atom was the size of our solar system, then one of these strings would be about the size of a tree here on planet Earth. In other words, a single string would be about 100 billion times smaller than an atom. Now, the beauty and the appeal of string theory is that it seems to unify all of the known laws of physics into what is called the theory of everything. The theory of everything has been the holy grail of physics this century. Everyone has been trying to get to this theory of everything. This is sometimes also known as the grand unified theory. It's a very exciting theory. However, it has a side effect. And that side effect is a doozy. For string theory to be true, more literally for unified string theory to be true, it requires that we exist in at least 11 space-time dimensions. That's 4 space-time dimensions than the 4 that we currently experience and observe ourselves. And so that really begins to open up some possibilities that we can start thinking about, and that is going to be the direction that we're going to be heading. Now, it's important to note that the elegant universe makes the point that string theory remains speculative. Even if one day string theory is found to be demonstrably false, then the concepts we're going to be discussing today could still very much be true, because these eyes are driven by the notion of extra-dimensionality, which already has scientific validity through Big Bang cosmology. String theory merely builds upon this extra-dimensionality that's afforded through Big Bang cosmology. Now, before we start talking about extra-dimensionality, let's be clear that we understand exactly what dimensions are. So, each of the 4 space-time dimensions of the physical universe is independent of the others. And so, lines can be drawn infinitely far and infinitely long along the dimension of width, along the dimension of depth, and along the dimension of height, without any of those lines intersecting with another line or another dimension. That means that each one of those dimensions, each one of those lines must be at least 90-degree angle, at a 90-degree angle to each of the other dimensions. So a one-dimensional realm is a single line, and that realm includes only points and lines fixed along that one-dimensional line. And so we're going to call this dimension width. Now, it's important to note that if you only have a single dimension, that absolutely everything has to fit on that line, on that single dimension. You can't have that line and then have another point that exists off to the side somewhere. No, for that point to exist, that requires another dimension of space. That would require space to be something like a plane. So a two-dimensional realm is a plane. Think of the surface of the screen, if you will. It is described by 2 lines that are at right angles to each other. We're going to call these lines width and height. And so in such a realm, you still can have points. You can still have lines as you do in a single dimension. But now you can have figures. Now you can have circles. You can have squares. And you can have triangles that are all possible. Now, a 3-dimensional realm is a volume defined by 3 dimensions. And each line defining one of the dimensions is at a right angle to each of the other 2 lines. We're going to call these lines width, height, and depth. So once again, you still have points and lines. You still have figures like you do in 2 dimensions. But now in 3 dimensions, you can have solids. You can have spheres. You can have cones. You can have cubes. Now, this is a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional cube. And so if you look at the depth angle, it says that the depth angle is 90 degrees, but in reality, in 2D, that's really only, about a 45-degree angle? But we're 3-dimensional beings. We know that this is a 2-dimensional representation, and in 3 dimensions, that depth angle really is at a 90-degree angle. And so when we see a 2-dimensional drawing like this, trying to represent a 3-dimensional object, we understand it. We know what it is really like. We know what it looks like. That's an important point that we're going to revisit as we get into the theology later. So the book Flatland was written by Edwin Abbott, and it was first published in 1884. And Abbott was a clergyman, he was a Shakespearean scholar, and he also liked to dabble in dimensions. And the book Flatland is really big in nerd culture, okay? If you watch The Big Bang Theory, there's been a couple of times where they've mentioned the book Flatland in Big Bang. So I mention that because if you ever find yourself surrounded by a bunch of nerds and you feel really uncomfortable and out of place, just mention the book Flatland. And they'll all just say, all right, you're one of us, you're in. Okay, so just a little piece of advice there, life advice. So we're going to use this book to think dimensionally. And as we begin to think dimensionally, then we can start to think extra dimensionally and look at some of these theological paradoxes and how extra dimensions might help to save those. Now, this is going to be a thought experiment similar to the way that Einstein uses thought experiments in the formulation of his theories. And so it's going to start out cute and simple. Frankly, it's going to start off a little childlike. You're going to think that I'm an elementary librarian reading to you at times, okay? But we're going to progress deeper and deeper. And as we get to the end of this thought experiment, I can almost guarantee you there's going to be a couple of eye-opening, thought-provoking aha moments before we start to get into the theology. So Flatland is a fictional story about a two-dimensional universe that's called Flatland. And so we're going to think about the surface of the floor. Okay, so Flatland contains width, it contains depth, but it contains no height whatsoever. And that means that in Flatland, you can have points and lines. You can also have shapes like circles and squares and triangles, but there are no volumes, there are no cubes, there's nothing three-dimensional that's allowed in Flatland. Now, because Flatland is flat and there's no height, there's no heavenly bodies. Light is universal throughout all of Flatland. Now, the Flatlanders have yet to figure out where that light comes from, but the fact that it's universal throughout Flatland means that there are no shadows in Flatland. No shadows makes it difficult for its citizens to recognize each other. So, for example, if there was a coin that was on the floor, we as three-dimensional beings, we could look down and we could see that that coin was a circle. However, a Flatland can only see it from its side. It can only view it from its edge. And so when a Flatlander looks at that coin, all it sees is a line. And without any shadowing, it can't see any curvature or any angles. All it sees is that line. And so in this analogy that you'll find in the book, you have the Flatlander's eye on the right-hand side, you have the shape on the left-hand side, but in between the eye and the shape is the line, which is anything that any Flatlander can see. Now, in Flatland, all the women are straight lines, soldiers and lower-class citizens are isosceles triangles, the middle class are equilateral triangles, the professional class are squares and pentagons, hexagons and polygons, which are multi-sided shapes, make up the nobility. Notice how the more shapes you have, the higher up your stature is in society. Did I mention this was written in 1884 during the Victorian era? So I'll caution you ladies that if you read this book, it's not the most flattering picture of women. I'll just let you know that. Now, priests are commonly called circles. They're not actually circles. They're actually multi-sided polygons. Their angles and their sides are so numerous that they're practically indistinguishable from a circle. Now, some of the priests in Flatland think that they're perfect circles, but that's another sermon altogether. Now, Flatlanders only have one eye in that two dimensions. So that combined with equal lighting, again, it limits their depth perception. It limits their perspective and their ability to visually recognize the shape of various objects. And if you can't recognize the shape of an object, then you're going to have a difficult time recognize the other citizens of Lineland. And so they practice something that is called sight recognition. Now, in the more temperate climates where you have fog, sight recognition is something that's practiced by everybody because the fog adds depth to the objects. However, outside of those temperate climates, only the nobility have the time to practice such an abstract art as sight recognition. And it really does, it requires a habitual practice, and it's something that you have to practice all the time lest you lose the skill. Because, in nobility, you can't walk up and start feeling a person and counting how many sides they have. No, that would be completely politically incorrect. Okay? Nor is it polite to ask someone how many sides they have to determine who they are or what they are, and so they're forced to use sight recognition. The blue-collar workers, they just don't have time for such studies. So, one evening, our main character, who we're going to call Edwin, he had a dream. He visited another universe that was very different from his own. This universe existed merely on a line, on a single dimension, and it was called Lineland. However, since he was a two-dimensional being, he could exist off to the side of that dimension, and he could see it from the side. He could see the lines and the points that were in Lineland. As he observed the citizens of Lineland, he could hear moments of chirping and twittering. And as he looked at the citizens of Lineland, he could see some of them just sort of vibrating in their place, sort of moving back and forth just in their spot. And very curious, and because women were lines in Flatland, he saw a long line, and so he asked, "Woman, what is the manner of this chirping and this motion to and fro?" And the line replied in a very deep, stern voice, "I am no woman. I am the monarch of the world." Well, Edwin apologized. He mentioned, "Listen, I'm a stranger in these parts. I've never been here before, and I apologize. I didn't mean anything by that." Now, as he began to converse with the monarch, it became clear that the monarch believed that line, which he called his kingdom, he thought that was the entire universe. He was oblivious to any space outside of Lineland. Edwin also learned that all of the lines, in fact, were men and all the women were points. In observing the citizens of Lineland, he noticed that there was not enough space for one Linelander to move past another Linelander. So very obviously, it became a fact that once a neighbor, always a neighbor. He also noticed that no Linelander could distinguish another one by sight, because if you're a Linelander and you look to your left, then all you can see is a point. Now, it may only be a point, like a woman, and it may just be the end of a line that continues that way, and you have no idea how far that line might continue. But whether you look to your left or whether you look to your right, all you can see is a point. So Edwin then asked the monarch, "So how do you distinguish by sight the shape and the position of your subjects?" And the monarch interjected, "You speak of an absolute impossibility. Everyone knows it is impossible to distinguish by sight whether one is a point or a line, or to know the length or the position of another. I mean, you must be hallucinating to think it possible. For instance, I am 6 inches of space." You mean length. Excuse me? Well, you mean that you're 6 inches of length, not space. The monarch interjected, "Well, you fool, length is space. It is one and the same." Edwin replied, "But begging your pardon, length is not space. Space also contains front and back." Front and back, but by that do you mean east and west? No, east and west are to your left and to your right. North and south are in front and behind you. Preposterous! Show me this north and south. Well, I'm afraid I can't. This would require you leaving your line. What do you mean, leaving my line? Do you mean to imply that this north and south exist outside of the world, outside of space itself? Well, yes, outside of your world, outside of your space, for your space is not true space. No, true space is a plane, but your space is only a line. Well, if you cannot show me, then describe this north and south to me. Edwin replied, "Well, I fear that words will not be sufficient. I'll do my best to attempt to show you." Now, at this point, the monarch had just assumed that Edwin was another line elsewhere in his kingdom. However, Edwin asked the line next to the monarch to move aside and create some space between himself and the monarch. Edwin then moved into the line. Now, as soon as Edwin moved into the line, he appeared as a point immediately in front of the monarch. And the monarch exclaimed, I see you! I see you! Edwin continued to move through the line and told the monarch that he was moving from the south to the north, from the front to the back. The monarch countered, "No, not at all. You are still but a point, and you're not moving at all." Edwin then let the monarch know that he was exiting to the north, at which point he simply disappeared from the monarch's sight. The monarch shrieked, He is vanished! He is dead! I am not dead. I have merely left the straight line in which you call your world. I still exist in the true world. Edwin then began to explain how from his vantage point, he could not only see the monarch, but each of his neighbors and their neighbors beyond. He then began to describe each neighbor one after another, noting whether they were male or female and describing their length if they were male. The monarch replied in disbelief, accusing Edwin of some sort of a magic trick in appearing and then vanishing, and noting that Edwin's description of the location, sex, and length of each neighbor was unimpressive, as this is something that each child in his kingdom must learn and memorize from birth. At this point, Edwin realized that any attempt to explain the real world, that is, Flatland, would be in vain, as the monarch would never be able to comprehend it. Edwin then awoke from his dream. Well, the very next day, Edwin was in his house when he began to feel a presence. Edwin became still in order to listen to see if he could hear anyone else in the house, but hearing nothing, but still feeling the presence, Edwin cried out, "Hello? Is anybody here?" And a strange voice from nowhere replied, "Hello, Edwin." Edwin replied, Who is this? Show yourself." Now keep in mind that Edwin was very capable of sight recognition, so at this moment a point appeared in the room, and then immediately that point expanded into a smaller circle, which continued to expand into a larger circle. And as soon as it reached its maximum size, it began to contract into a smaller circle until it returned to a mere point and then vanished from Edwin's sight. This shape, this entity, this whatever it was, changed to shape in a manner never seen before. Edwin was amazed and for a moment wholly speechless. After he gathered himself, but still sensing the presence as before, Edwin asked, "Are you still here?" The stranger replied, "Yes, I'm still here. You just can't see me because I'm above the plane of your universe." Edwin asked, "Above? What do you mean above? Do you mean north?" The stranger replied, "No, I don't mean north. I mean above. You have north and south, east and west, but I can exist in the height above your universe." Edwin replied, "But what are you? I have never seen anyone change shapes as you have." The stranger identified himself as a sphere. He noted that he begins as a point on one end with a series of circles growing increasingly larger and then increasingly smaller again until they end as a point on the other end. The sphere further elaborated, "Last night in your dream, you visited a place called Lineland. When you entered Lineland, it did not have enough space to represent the whole of you. When you entered Lineland, you existed merely as a line all the time that you passed through that universe. They simply were not able to see the whole of you. Likewise, when I enter your world, Flatland is unable to represent the whole of me. I am a sphere, which means that I am a solid. And when I enter your world, you can only see a slice of me at a time. Now, what appears to you as one circle expanding and contracting is merely a series of circles representing my surface as I enter and exit your world." Edwin then asked the sphere to demonstrate himself. Just as Edwin described to the monarch what was on the other side of him in Lineland, he asked the sphere to describe what was on the other side of the house and what was on the other side of the next house. The sphere then shocks Edwin when he reveals, "Edwin, I can not only see what's on the other side of your house and the next, but simultaneously, I can also see what is inside your house. I can not only see inside your house, but simultaneously, I can see inside each room. I can see inside each closet and each cabinet. The sphere then began to describe the various objects throughout each room of the house. And if that wasn't enough, the sphere then told Edwin, in fact, he could see inside of Edwin. He described the internal workings of Edwin's eye, the electrical charges in his brain, and even the contents of his stomach, which were being digested as they spoke. Stunned, Edwin shrieked, "Either this is madness or it is hell." "It is neither," replied the sphere. "It is knowledge. It is 3 dimensions. I will open your eyes so that you may see." At that moment, the sphere pulled Edwin out of Flatland and into Spaceland. Edwin was able to see all that had just been described to him before. He saw shapes and forms of which no Flatlander had ever seen before. I actually own 2 animated DVDs based on the book Flatland. This is a screenshot from one of those, so I'm actually an officer in nerd culture at this time, just FYI. Edwin exclaimed, "Behold, I have become like God, for no Flatlander has ever seen such glory." Once Edwin had come to appreciate the truth and the magnitude of what he was learning, he turned to the sphere and he asked the very curious question, "May I see your insides?" The sphere replied in bewilderment, "Excuse me?" Edwin then reasoned, well, if 2 dimensions allows one to see things inaccessible to linelanders, and if 3 dimensions allows one to see things unviewable to a Flatlander, then 4 dimensions must surely allow one to see things unavailable to those in Spaceland. Can you take me to the land of 4 dimensions? To which the sphere replied, "Well, that's preposterous. There is no such place with 4 dimensions. This is it. Spaceland is the whole of the universe." Edwin replied, "My Lord, your wisdom has inspired me to aspire to one even more great, more beautiful, and more closely approximate to perfection than yourself. I mean, as you yourself, superior to all Flatland forms, combine many circles in one, so doubtless there is one above you who combines many spheres into one supreme existence, surpassing even the solids of Spaceland. And even as we, who are not in space, look down on Flatland and see the insides of all things, so of a certainty there is yet above us some higher, purer region, whither thou dost surely purpose to lead me, some yet more spacious space, some more dimensionable dimensionality." But disbelieving, the sphere replies, "There is no such land. The idea of it is utterly inconceivable." Well, at this point, we're going to leave the imagination of Edwin Abbott, and we're going to start thinking about 4 dimensions of space. We're going to start thinking about what would 4 dimensions of space, and how would that open up our understanding. So once again, if you have 4 dimensions of space, then that 4th dimension has to connect at a 90-degree angle to each of the other 3 dimensions, right? And so 4 dimensions of space is called hyperspace. And so what you see here is a hypercube. And so again, this is a 2-dimensional representation of a 4-dimensional hypercube. Now, as 3-dimensional beings, we can see the cube. We can visualize and we can understand that. But when we look at how the multidimensional cube, the hypercube, connects, it's a genuine challenge for us to visualize that. Similar to the inability of the linelanders to perceive Flatland, and similar to the inability of the Flatlanders to perceive Spaceland. It's genuinely difficult for us to perceive what is possible and visualize how things are in hyperspace. Imagine our conversation with a 4-dimensional being, and we're trying to get him to explain to us, well, where does that 4th dimension connect? And we ask, where is it? Is it up? Is it up somewhere? And that 4-dimensional being says, no, it's not up. No, you have north and south, you have east and west, you have up and down, but in the 4th dimension, we have this way and that way. Did that help? Can you visualize that? Do you understand? Let's look at a couple of analogies to sort of make the point. So imagine that we're three-dimensional beings and we're talking to two-dimensional Flatlanders, and they have a basketball. Now, of course, that basketball in Flatland is going to be flat. It's just going to be a circle. But we tell those Flatlanders, you know what? I can take that basketball and I can make one side touch the other side without cutting its surface. Those Flatlanders will look at that basketball and they'll spin it to the left and they'll spin it to the right. And they'll think, well, if we could cut that basketball, cut it in two, then we could turn it around both sides 180 degrees and make one side touch the other. But no, you can't cut the basketball. You have to do it without cutting it. Well, it wouldn't take them long to realize that in 2 dimensions, that's impossible. But as the 3-dimensional being, we know that we can take that flat basketball and we can take the edges or the sides and we can curl it up into the height dimension and make one edge touch the other edge. Now, what about a 3-dimensional basketball? What if we have one of those? So we're talking to a 4-dimensional being, and that 4-dimensional being tells us, you know what? I can take that basketball and I can turn it inside out without cutting its surface. Well, as 3-dimensional beings, we would look at this basketball and, we would dribble it, we might pass it, we can throw it around, shoot it, we can do all sorts of things with it, but as we look at it, how do we turn it inside out without cutting it? Now, if I could cut it, I could stick a knife in here and cut it all the way over to the other side and then take it and flip it inside through the slit that I just cut. But the 4-dimensional being says, no, you got to do it without cutting it. Well, in 3 dimensions, that's impossible. It can't be done. But in 4 dimensions, it's easy. It's elementary. Even a child would be able to recognize how to do it. Now, in August, when Dr. Roberts was here and he saw that we were going to be doing this, we were talking about it afterwards, and he said that and he gave me an analogy that I thought was also a very good one. So he said, imagine that you've got 2-dimensional hooks. And you've got these 2-dimensional hooks that are hooked together, and as a 3-dimensional being, you tell the Flatlanders that you can unhook those hooks without breaking either one of them. Well, they'll look at those hooks and they will maybe tug it one way, they might tug it another way, they might spin it this way or spin it that way, but it won't take them long to realize that there's no way they can unhook those hooks without breaking one of the hooks. Well, of course, as 3-dimensional beings, we know that all we have to do is lift one of them into the height dimension and unhook them. Now imagine that we have 3-dimensional links in a chain. And a 4-dimensional being tells us, you know what? I can unhook one link from another without breaking the link. And we would play with that chain, we would look at it, we would tug on it, we would spin it, we could do everything with it, and it wouldn't take us long to realize you can't do that. You can't unlink one link from the chain without breaking the other link. However, in 4 dimensions of space, that 4-dimensional being would only have to remove one of the links, pulling it into the 4th dimension to unhook it from the other length. Can you imagine that? Can you visualize that? The main point is this: what is illogical, impossible, and inconceivable in a space with a given set of dimensions, for example, 2 dimensions, becomes very conceivable, demonstrably possible, and even elementary when simply adding another dimension. Adding yet another dimension opens up possibilities even further. So that's the first part, that's the first half. We did all that to get to this, okay? So I'm just going to take a quick little sip. Oftentimes when we're doing this live, we'll just take a 5-minute break, but since this is online, we're just going to go ahead and push through it. So now we're going to talk about the theology, and we're going to begin by looking at the concept of the Trinity. So Matthew quotes Jesus, "Therefore go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." So the word Trinity never occurs in the Bible. There is no systematic teaching of the Trinity in the Bible. Jews reject God's triunity or the Trinity as a violation of God's oneness. Muslims mock its mathematical absurdity as proof that their beliefs make more sense. However, more than 500 scripture verses, Old and New Testament, refer to God as both singular and plural. And Orthodox Bible-believing Christians have long believed that the Bible teaches that God is a Trinity, that He is three persons in one, consisting of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Now, over the millennia, theologians have struggled to try and come up with illustrations or analogies for the Trinity. One very common one, one very popular one, is comparing it to an egg. An egg is just one egg, but the egg is made up of three parts. You have the egg yolk, you have the egg white, and you have the shell. There are three parts, but just one egg. Other scholars, other theologians try to look at a single person and how they have multiple relationships or multiple identities with other persons. For example, in this photo, you see me on the far left-hand side. Well, I'm the husband to my wife. I'm the father to my daughter. I'm the son of my father. It's just me, but there's three completely different, independent relationships, between the other individuals. Now, the fact of the matter is there really is no earthly way to accurately illustrate the Trinity because all of our analogies and illustrations are hampered by one major flaw. We're all trying to illustrate a multidimensional being within our three dimensions of space. So every analogy that we give is going to be inaccurate or theologically inaccurate in some way. However, perhaps this concept of extra dimensionality might help us to make sense how God could be one being but still be three persons without avoiding logic and reason. Now, in order to better understand how this might be possible, let's go back and look again at what life is like in Flatland. So we're going to pretend for a moment that we're above the universe of Flatland. Now, I can place myself within a fraction of an inch. I can place my body or myself. Let's imagine that Flatland is sort of the surface of this stand at the top. I can, in the height dimension, remaining above Flatland, put my finger literally within just a fraction of an inch from Edwin, and he would be completely oblivious to my presence, completely oblivious to the fact that I was so close to him as long as I'm not inhabiting his universe. Now, if I choose, I can go ahead and put my finger on Flatland, and the Flatlanders will see me by the space that I inhabit in their universe, and they'll see the dot of my fingertip and only a dot. If I choose, I might be able to stick my arm through Flatland like the sphere was able to go through Flatland, and once again, they would only see me by the slice of me that inhabits their surface at that time. But let's pretend for a moment that I stick my finger on one side of Flatland. I take my left hand and I put it on another side of Flatland, and I decided to stick my head down and put my ear in yet another part of Flatland. They would only see me by the space that I am inhabiting in their universe, and they would see three separate shapes, three separate beings in three separate locations, independent of one another. They would have no idea about the totality of my being. And if one of the Flatlanders would suggest that these three different objects that have now entered Flatland were actually all a part of one greater and grander being, that would not make any sense. The other Flatlanders probably would not believe it for a moment. They wouldn't understand the concept of it. Now, the inability of the Flatlanders to recognize the totality of me comes from their living and existing in a dimension that is just one dimension shy of the three-dimensional realm in which I exist. String theory is now suggesting that God may have a minimum of 11 dimensions that He experiences and interacts with us. And so, as you can see, the inability of the Flatlanders to comprehend us by one dimension, our ability to understand and comprehend God and what He can do, falls shy by a greater magnitude than we could ever imagine. Now, lest you think that this is just some sort of a really liberal, New Age way of looking at this, I want to read to you something that was written by one of the great Christian apologists that was written in World War II. And of course, this is C.S. Lewis writing in Mere Christianity. He notes, "A world of one dimension would be a straight line. In a two-dimensional world, you still get straight lines, but many lines make one figure. In a three-dimensional world, you still get figures, but many figures make one solid body. In other words, as you advance to the more real and the more complicated levels, you do not leave behind you the things that you found on the simpler levels. No, you still have them, but combined in new ways, in ways that you could not imagine if you knew only the simpler levels. Now, the Christian account of God involves just the same principle. On the human level, the human level is a simple and rather empty level. And on the human level, one person is one being, and any two persons are two separate beings. Just as in two dimensions, say on a flat sheet of paper, one square is one figure, and any two squares are two separate figures. On the divine level, you still find personalities, but up there you find them combined in new ways which we, who do not live on that level, cannot imagine. In God's dimension, so to speak, we find a being who is three persons while remaining one being, just as a cube is six squares while remaining one cube. And we don't know the extent of God's abilities, His attributes, or His extra dimensionality. But again, if we can start thinking of God as being an extra dimensional being, then it might open our eyes to be able to give us another way, perhaps a fresh way, to look at some of these biblical paradoxes. So Jesus, both man and God, both dead and alive. So one time I was flipping through the channels looking for something to watch, and I landed on this program called 30 Days. 30 Days was a program that would take two different people from opposite polar ends of the spectrum, and one of them would live with the other for 30 days, living in their shoes, so to speak. In this particular episode, they had a Christian who was living with a Muslim family for 30 days. And as I began to watch it, the Christian was sitting on one side of a sofa, and he was talking to a Muslim cleric on the other side of the sofa, and the conversation went something like this. The cleric said, well, because the one that's died on the cross, if that happened, that is physical death. And we believe God doesn't die. God is the Lord running the show. If God dies, then who's going to run the show? If God dies, who's going to run it? See, you cannot have a dead God. The Christian says, well, you're trying to get me to say that God doesn't die. The cleric says, He doesn't die. You got it. Well, how would you respond to this? Dr. Ross notes, the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, the coming in flesh, refers to God entering human life in a human body. Jesus Christ, the second person of the triune God, the creator of all angels and of the entire universe, actually became a man. He did this of His own free will without external compulsion. And the incarnation is possible, meaning God on earth, God with and among us, and God in heaven because of God's extra-dimensional capacities. Now, Jesus voluntarily relinquished the independent use of His divine attributes and His extra-dimensional capacities. He accepted all the functional limitations of a human body, all the needs, the weaknesses, the desires, sufferings, and the trials of human life, apart from sin or sinning. Now, if I decided to voluntarily exist in Flatland, once again, I could put my finger on the surface of Flatland and I could put myself inside of Edwin's home if I so choose. Now, you have to keep in mind that for Flatlanders, all those lines are physical structures. And so Edwin, he has to enter and exit homes, he has to enter and exit rooms through openings, just like we do in Spaceland. However, as a three-dimensional being, I'm not required to do that. I can simply withdraw myself from Flatland, and I can put my finger back down in another location in Flatland, wherever I choose to do it. The height dimension gives me access to that. However, if I wanted to, I could also submit to the laws of physics of Flatland. And with my finger still on the surface, I could choose to enter and leave buildings through any opening, just like any Flatlander, okay? Now, obviously, if God can create and enter dimensions, He can remove and leave them. And with such capacities, He has free reign in choosing which ones He will use to interact with us. Further, He can choose to be bound to or to use one set of dimensions for certain contexts while choosing other set of dimensions for other contexts. One demonstration of Jesus' ability to transition between contexts, to transition between his humanity and his divinity, can be seen in the crossing of the stormy Galilee Sea. If you recall, Jesus was asleep in the boat, and as they were crossing, a squall came up, and the storm threatened to capsize the vessel, and so the disciples were afraid, and they decided they needed to wake Jesus. So they woke Jesus, and he extended his arm, and he said, "Peace, be still." Immediately, the wind and the waves died down and became calm. Dr. Ross notes, this incident shows Jesus' capacity to transition between contexts. First, we see Jesus submitting to the wind and the waves. And the next moment, however, Jesus exercises control and authority as God the Father's agent over the elements. In the first context, we see Jesus' humanity. In the second, we see his divinity. Jesus can be both God and man because he alone can choose when and where and with what part of his being, in essence, to operate in whatever form over whatever dimensions he pleases. Jesus Christ paying the penalty for our sin may be the most dramatic example of his ability to transition between contexts. Because of his divine nature, he elected to stay and not escape the torturous death until the penalty price had been paid. But then he was able to rise again and be alive again after 3 days. Dr. Ross notes that this shows that Jesus has the power to limit any portion of his capacities and powers to any degree he chooses, whenever and wherever he chooses, and along whatever space-time dimensions he chooses. But the converse is also true. Jesus can expand any portion of his capacities and powers to any degree he chooses, whenever and wherever he chooses, and along whatever space-time dimensions he chooses. Some skeptics, like the Muslim cleric, recognize that it's hard to say that a person can be both dead and alive at the same time. That would appear to be irrational. Of course, many people have used that line of reasoning to argue that Christianity is unreasonable and it's not worth your belief because it's an irrational faith. However, Dr. Ross makes the point, and the main point, is that the simultaneity of Jesus' death and immortality would only be a contradiction, however, if the time, place, and the context of his death were identical to the time, place, and the dimensional context of his being alive. Even with respect to human death, we understand that when we die, there's going to be an extra-dimensional gain. Now, we may not use that kind of terminology, but we recognize that when we die, it's not going to be an annihilation. We're not going to completely exist no more or no longer. We understand that our souls will survive us. Ultimately, we know our existence continues when our physical bodies can no longer sustain us. The Bible teaches, and we believe, that our soul will continue to exist in some capacity, and even the Muslim cleric would acknowledge that a person can be both physically dead and spiritually alive at the same time. And so because of Christ's identity as God and his access to all the dimensions or the super dimensions God encompasses, he would experience suffering and death in all of the human-occupied dimensions and then transition to any of his other dimensions or realms once the atonement price had been paid. Evidencing his divine nature, again, Jesus paid the price and then returned in humanly form. As man, Jesus' earthly body was dead in every sense of the word. But as God, he was and is still very much alive, existing with the same use of any portion of his capacities and powers to any degree he chooses, whenever and wherever he chooses, and along whatever space-time dimensions he chooses. So this next one is like a ghost. So John tells us, he describes this event. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for the fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Luke describes the same event. He says, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Well, Well, these two passages are describing the same event. So this is Sunday of Resurrection Sunday, and the disciples were huddling in this room. They were gathered together for fear of the Jews, but they were also swapping the stories, and some of them eyewitness reports, and some of them are reports that they had heard about Jesus' appearance and people seeing him throughout the day. Now, how theologians have come to interpret this over the millennia, you can see that theologians are divided in the way that they interpret this. All you have to do is read a handful of commentaries to see the different perspective. So this first one is Matthew Henry. He notes, well, this does not at all weaken the evidence of his having a real human body after his resurrection. Though the doors were shut, he knew how to open them without any noise and come in so that they might not hear him. And then Adam Clark notes, nevertheless, Jesus came in, the doors being shut, meaning while they continued shut. But how? Well, by his almighty power. And further, we know not. Yet, it is quite possible that no miraculous influence is here intended. The doors might be shut for the fear of the Jews, and Jesus might open them and enter in the ordinary way. So they attempt to take the naturalistic route. My father, in his notes on the Gospel of John, says, how Jesus appeared in the locked room is not explained, but it is an indication that his resurrected body is different from his pre-resurrected body. The NIV Study Bible affirms Jesus himself stood among them behind locked doors, indicating that his body was of a different order. The Wycliffe Bible says, the implication is plain that Jesus passed through the closed doors. He had the power to dematerialize his body. And the Jameson, Faust, and Brown commentary says that this was not an entrance in the ordinary way, as manifest not only from the very special manner of expression, but from the corresponding language of Luke 24. And then Dr. Ross summarizes, the disciples' shock arises not only from their inability to comprehend how Jesus could be alive and present, but also from their knowledge that physical objects cannot pass through physical barriers without damage to either the object or the barrier. No wonder they concluded that Jesus must be a ghost. What they saw made no sense to them. Now, if Jesus is the Son of God, then we would expect him to be able to transition between dimensions, especially if he had a hand in creating all the space-time dimensions that we currently experience in this universe. Now, some people, in an attempt to try and explain this away, try to look to a more naturalistic explanation so that Jesus' post-resurrected body could be maintained to be the same as his pre-resurrected body. However, the description in Luke certainly seems to indicate that this is some sort of a miraculous event. However, if Jesus had extra-dimensional capacities like we've been talking about before, and some of you may even be jumping ahead of me already visualizing how we may not be limited to just those two options. It may be possible that Jesus simply withdrew from that three dimension of space outside the room and then re-entered inside the room. Remember that in Flatland, once a neighbor, always a neighbor. In one dimension of space, one linelander doesn't have enough space to pass another. However, two-dimensional Edwin was able to withdraw from lineland and enter it at any place that he chose. Also recall how the three-dimensional sphere was able to enter and withdraw from Flatland. He could enter any house or any room that he pleased. Similarly, if Jesus was outside the house, outside the room, he could just simply withdraw and place himself back inside the room without having to go in through any physical structures. At this point in the study, I hope that that is very easy for you to visualize and for you to understand. Once while I was discussing this with some family members over the dinner table, one of them started to look very uncomfortable and said, doesn't this lessen the divine mystery of God when we start to think of him in this way? And my response was that of the Apostle Paul, not at all, exclamation point. Even though it might help to open our imagination, open our minds to the possibility, it does nothing to lessen the miraculous nature of it because only God and Jesus have access to those multidimensional realms. It's still a miracle. I'd like to see any of you try it. We can stand here and wait. Go ahead. Go ahead and remove yourself from space, go outside, come back in. It's still a miracle because of Jesus' ability and his access to the multidimensional realms. Dr. Michael Strauss, who's a particle physicist at the University of Oklahoma, he read this once, and he gave me a couple of tips and pointers, and one of the points that he made that I thought was very good is that it is important to note that what we are discussing and visualizing is a minimal model of God. God is so much more than we can discuss here and more than we will ever be able to comprehend and grasp. The best we can do is to stretch our understanding to represent a larger portion of God than we knew before. Now, biblically, we know that God desires to be known. The scientific enterprise began under a Christian worldview, and you had intellectual giants like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, as well as others who viewed science as a form of worship. Similar to the Bible student who attempts to know God better by studying His Word, the early scientists attempted to know the Creator more fully by understanding His creation. For us, this is just another window as we attempt to peer into the awesome wonder and the power of God. As we attempt to try and fully know Him better, we're armed with more knowledge, more ideas about God and about what He is capable of. So our next one is, who created God? Or if God created us, who created God? Sometimes you will hear, well, if God created the universe, then who created God? And that question is timeless. It has been asked for centuries, and it has been answered for centuries, but it's a natural question that arises as we start to learn cause and effect behavior, and as we start to learn about the nature of existence. So both the Bible and science affirm that the universe, with everything it contains, had a beginning. Now, time as we know it also had a beginning, is confined to a single timeline or dimension, and is further limited to moving in one direction along that line. Now, we can neither stop nor reverse time's arrow. And so the question of God's beginning reflects our understanding of the following principle: because the universe and everything in it had a beginning, whatever exists has a starting point along that line of time and was caused by something or someone with an earlier starting point. It's elementary cause and effect. Now, if you were able to watch the Elegant Universe DVD, then you will remember that Einstein recognized that for general relativity to work, time must be viewed as its own dimension. He came up with the idea of space-time dimensions. Now, Scripture notes in several places that God had no beginning, that He has no end, and He was not created. And from our earlier discussion, we noted how the Bible affirms that God exists outside the timeline of our universe. He created our dimension of time. However, if God exists outside the timeline of our universe, and if God can create space and time, then He might have access to more dimensions of time than the single dimension of our universe. Dr. Ross notes, therefore, our universe may be situated on a fixed timeline which lies within at least a two-dimensional plane of time. Unlike us, God is not limited to the timeline of our universe. God is a being who has the capacity to create our time dimension and fix its direction, a being who possesses apparently unlimited time capacities himself. Now, because we recognize that God exists outside the timeline of our universe, some theologians have taken to calling God timeless. The problem with that is that time is defined as sequential relations or sequential events in which one event succeeds after another. So to call God timeless would imply that He exists in a reality where events don't precede one another or follow one another. And so Dr. Ross makes the point, and perhaps it would be more accurate to refer to God as being time full. God is full of time. God has access to all the time that he needs because he can create all the space-time dimensions he needs. Now, just how many dimensions of time God has access to or that he has created, we have no idea. We've not been told, but if we can think about maybe God having access to a plane of time, that might help to resolve some paradoxes that we've struggled with for a long time. So Dr. Ross notes that if time were two-dimensional, then God could have an infinite number of timelines represented by the grouping A that are running in an infinite number of directions. If God were so to choose, he could move and operate for an infinite time forward and backwards on timeline B that never intersects or touches the timeline of our universe represented by C. As such, he would have no beginning, he would have no end, he would not be created. God, thus, has the capacity to move and operate backwards and forwards along an infinitely long timeline or along as many timelines, infinite or otherwise, as he chooses. He can operate, if he desires, on a timeline parallel to our timeline or one that intersects our timeline, but he's not compelled to do either. Now, biblically, we know that the universe had a beginning, and since beginnings only make sense in a time dimension that is somehow linear, if God has access to a plane of time, then the idea of a beginning really doesn't make much sense. And so this kind of helps us better understand the words of the Apostle Paul. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things were created by him and for him, but he is before all things. Another argument that you'll often hear that I think also helps to understand why the question is irrelevant to ask who created God is the cosmological argument. So the cosmological argument is a syllogism, and so the first premise is anything that begins to exist must have a cause. The second premise, well, the universe began to exist, and so in deductive logic, that leads to the conclusion, well, then the universe must have a cause. Now, this doesn't apply to God because of premise number 2. God never began to exist. Okay, now, over 100 years ago, most scientists thought that the universe didn't begin to exist. They thought that it was eternal. They thought that it was infinite in size, and so the cosmological argument did not work at that time. But now that we know that the universe began to exist, we can see deductively that it must require a cause. We don't have to ask the same question in regard to God because he never had a beginning. Prayer. So when I was a child and I would sit in the church service and corporately we would be asked to bow our heads and pray, and as a child I would just sort of bow, and most of the time, I'll be candid with you, I didn't pray. I was just sitting there waiting for it to end so I could raise my head again, right? But sometimes I had things really on my mind and I really wanted to pray to God, but we have all these other people that are bowing their head and they're praying at the same time, and some of them are deacons. Surely God's going to listen to them before he's going to listen to me, just a kid. And I would think about all the other churches that are having service at the same time, praying at the same time, and all the other churches in the same time zone that are doing the same thing. And it just boggled my mind that God could possibly listen to my prayer and pay attention with so many others going on at the same time. As an adult, as I attempt to communicate with others, it's impossible for me to communicate simultaneously with other people. There are literally times that I will be at work and I'll be on the phone, and while I'm on the phone talking to someone, another call's coming in, my secretary is pinging me, telling me so-and-so's on line 2. At the same time, my phone is going off in my pocket, and it's either a text or somebody's trying to call me, or I'm getting a text via WhatsApp, or somebody's trying to call me via WhatsApp. And at the same time, my computer is dinging because this little notification comes up. I'm getting an email, somebody saying, "Hey, John, I need this urgently." I can't tell you how often that happens and how stressful it is. And that's because we humans cannot talk to everybody at the same time. We have to communicate with each other sequentially. However, if we can start to think about time as being a plane, we can visualize how it might be possible for God to give every single one of us undivided attention at the same instant. So in a two-dimensional time plane such as this, God's capacity to communicate with any of us can be shown by extending a perpendicular line from our timeline represented as B. So on this perpendicular line A, God could have access to an infinite amount of time while we experience but a single instant on timeline B. God would be able to give individual, undivided attention to any number of prayers occurring simultaneously at the same time at point B. Again, this simple illustration helps us to understand the words of Peter when he assures us that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous and his ears are attentive to their prayers. God's time versus our time. So, God's timing, there are times where it can bring this sense of wonder. A series of events will happen, and as we look back and we see the unfolding of what appears to be a very unlikely series of events, and we think, oh my gosh, God's hand was definitely in that. God is so good. I'm so thankful that it unfolded this way. Other times we look at God's timing and we have this puzzled sense of wonder and things are happening and we're going, wait a minute, God, what are you doing? This isn't what I was praying for. This isn't how I saw this unfolding or imagining. What is happening here? Sometimes God's timing is difficult for us to suggest because we ask for something, we want it to happen right then. Well, it may not happen that way, and sometimes things that we want to play out slowly, sometimes they happen more quickly. Well, once again, looking at a two-dimensional plane of time may help us to visualize how God's time is different from our time. Now, biblically, we're told that this is the way it is. The psalmist notes, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by." Peter elaborates on this verse in the New Testament, "With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day." The NIV Study Bible commentary says, "God does not view time as we humans do." I'd say God does not experience time as we humans do. He stands above time, with the result that when time is seen in the light of eternity, an age appears no longer than one short day, and a day seems no shorter than a long age. So here in this simple illustration, we can see how God could choose to operate along a variety of timelines, such as timeline A and B. Now, though A and B have equal length, now they are equal. It's an optical illusion that A is longer than B, but I measured them and they are equal. Even though they're equal, if we superimpose them on our timeline X, you would see that we would experience A as lasting much longer than B. So as this figure illustrates, Dr. Ross notes, what seems like a long time to us can be a short time to God, and vice versa. Peter's point was that God can experience the passing of time more quickly or more slowly than we humans do. He has the capacity to experience time at any rate he chooses. Again, that illustration just sort of helps us to visualize the reality of that. So when do we get to go to heaven? John quotes Jesus, "In my Father's house are many rooms, and if it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me so that you may also be where I am." Now, as Christians, we understand that when Christ returns, that God is going to create the new heavens and the new earth, and we're all going to receive our new bodies, our eternal bodies at that time. Now, one of the great eschatological questions has been, well, what happens to the deceased who die before the second coming? Where do they go? Many theologians have proposed, well, they must go to heaven. So they get to go to heaven, but they have to wait until the creation of the new heavens and the new earth, and then they'll receive their new bodies at that time. Other theologians say, no, you don't get to go to heaven. You don't get to go to heaven until Christ's return. No, we're all going to have to wait. We're going to be dormant. We're going to be asleep until that time. So we'll just simply lie dormant. We won't even notice it, but we'll be dormant, waiting for the second coming. Now, my wife Lacey was one who very quickly recognized that, if you can think of time extra-dimensionally, then that may be a bifurcation. That may be a false dichotomy. We may not be limited to those two perspectives. It might be possible that we have died sequentially, one after another, after another, after another, for thousands and thousands of years. We all leave and immediately go to that heaven, and we all, despite the difference in time, and when we left, we all immediately transition and enter heaven at the beginning of the new heavens and the new earth, at that new creation. So if you look at this artist rendition, I was always fascinated by this rendition as a child. It's an illustration of the second coming, and it would appear that this artist took the belief that we would all remain dormant. We would lie in our graves. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the graveyard, and you can see the souls rising up at the time of the second coming. Okay? But again, we may not be limited to that. Time might be some sort of a plane, and it might look something like this, or at least be extra-dimensional. So timeline A would represent the timeline of our universe. Timeline B would represent the possible timeline of the new heaven and the new earth, and each timeline that connects those two represents generations dying and departing the timeline of the universe, illustrating how we can all pass sequentially from this universe, but then all instantly arrive at the same time together at the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. Now, if you're a fan of the ABC television series Lost, it appears that they ended the series on this exact same concept. If you watch that, in the very last episode, the main character, Jack Shepherd, dies. And when he dies, he finds himself standing outside of a church which represented the afterlife. And as he's walking up to the doors of the church, his father comes up and walks up and stands beside him and starts to enter the church together. His father, who had died several decades before. And then as he enters the church, he notices other cast members also entering the church who had died in the seasons previous to him, as well as he looks around the church and he sees other cast members who he had left were also coming into the church, and they were all joining each other in the afterlife. Now, is this the way that's going to happen with us? I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, biblically, we're not told specifically, and that's why theologians have been divided for millennia. But again, if we can just start thinking about time extra-dimensionally, it again might open up the possibilities, and we may not be forced to choose between one alternative or another. So we're going to end it on this. We're going to talk about God's omniscience. So, as noted previously in the Bible, and also with Big Bang cosmology, we understand that we have one dimension of time, we have three dimensions of space. The universe had a beginning, so that implies that there's got to be a cause outside of this space, so there must be at least one dimension of time and one dimension of space that exists outside the four dimensions of space-time of our universe. Now, string theory is suggesting there may, in fact, be at least 7 more space-time exists. There could be more, but for unified string theory to be true, there has to be at least 7 dimensions of time. Now, previously, we've been talking about what might be possible if we start thinking of time as being two-dimensional, as being a plane of time. What if time is somehow three-dimensional? What if time is somehow some sort of a volume for God? God is full of time, and He has access to three-dimensional time. What possibilities might that open up? Well, King David, he starts his Psalm 139, "O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too lofty for me to attain." At the beginning of this psalm, David is praising the awesome wonder of God and his omniscience. And he's confessing that it's too grand for him to understand or to comprehend. As he puts it, it's too lofty for him to attain. Well, that remains true for us. But again, if we start to expand our imagination, if we start to think extra-dimensionally, what might time look like if God had access to three-dimensional time? Maybe time would look like a sphere. So as this illustration demonstrates, the horizontal line could symbolize the timeline of our universe. Point U, the far point to the left, that could be the time of creation. Point B could be the time of your birth. Point B would be the present, and D would be the timeline of your death. Point E could represent the end of the universe as we know it when Christ establishes his eternal kingdom in heaven. Now, each one of those there are vertical lines that intersect each one of those points. So we saw that in a two-dimensional time frame. However, in this three-dimensional time frame, each one of those vertical intersecting lines all go up, and all of them intersect at the same point G. We'll call this God's point in time, where they all intersect. From this one point in time, from this one single instant, God could see every event that happens in all time. He could see every event in your past, every event in your future. He would literally be able to see everything in exquisite detail at the same time. Many theologians refer to this as the eternal now, his ability to see the past, the present, and the future at the same time. And biblically, we know that God has this capacity. We know that he would be able to intersect any point in time to know anything that he wants to know. He could intersect any point in time to do anything he wants to do. He would be able to intersect any point in time to simply be present at any point. He would be eternally omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. The Bible tells us in regard to his omniscience, from heaven the Lord looks down and sees all mankind, and from his dwelling place he watches all who live on the earth. In regard to his omnipotence, Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And in regard to his omnipresence, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. The Bible has been declaring God's omniscience, his omnipotence, and his omnipresence for millennia. Is it possible that we're now just starting to open our imagination and to try and make sense of it? Now, as you begin to think about these theological concepts, it'll be very interesting to see how it will open your eyes to different things. And one of the things that I have really enjoyed is hearing from my family members some of the perspectives that they have gained after listening to this series. So, for example, my father, who is a retired pastor, he told me he always knew that heaven and hell were places that existed. But he also knew that, if we drilled to the center of the earth, we wouldn't find hell. If we had a spaceship that could go to all four corners of the universe, we'd never find heaven. He didn't quite know how to make sense of that, but he knew that they weren't here. And he said to be able to think extra-dimensionally about those and to understand that they might be parallel universes that exist, that don't come into contact with us. He said it kind of helped him get his mind around it better. He can more clearly visualize how heaven and hell can exist as places right now, but we cannot access them. My wife, Lacey, I mentioned before that when she started to think about time extra-dimensionally, she started to see that we may not be limited to those two options of when we get to go to heaven. Another perspective she offered was the clear understanding that we live in a lesser reality. In the same way that the Flatlanders live in a lesser reality, we live in a three-dimensional universe that is a lesser reality than God lives and experiences, and that when we go to heaven, it's probably going to be this greater reality that's going to be greater than we could imagine or we could fathom. My daughter Ashton, along the same lines, said that she came to more deeply appreciate the sacrifice that Jesus made when he came and entered life in human form and experienced our three-dimensional life. As she began to think about those Flatlanders and how flat they were and how constricted they were and how they couldn't, move around. And she's a volleyball player. I mean, no height in Flatland where you can't play volleyball. I mean, it was unimaginable to her. And she was thinking what it must have been like for Jesus to come and submit to our three-dimensional laws of physics so much of his life. What a sacrifice. She could not imagine having to experience life as a Flatlander after having the three-dimensional experience that we do. For me personally, one of the things that it helped me with is that I was always very frustrated with the lack of description of heaven in the Bible. If heaven is going to be this place where we're going to spend eternity, I would sure like to know more about it. And what we are told about it, scholars and theologians don't know whether to take it literally or whether it's just simply analogous, that it's going to be like. This helped me to realize God could tell me what heaven was going to be like in exquisite detail. And as a three-dimensional being, I would never be able to understand it. I wouldn't be able to comprehend it. I struggle with 4 dimensions. I can't imagine how a 4th dimension of space can connect at a 90-degree angle to the other 3 dimensions of space that we experience. I can't visualize and imagine how 4-dimensional beings can do those things with 3-dimensional objects. But I just have to accept that it's true. Again, God could have told us in exquisite detail what heaven was going to be like, and it would fall on deaf ears. We wouldn't be able to understand it. Instead, perhaps God has chosen to tell us, and just to simply make the point, listen, heaven is the place where you're going to want to be. Trust me, I'm going to be there. You're going to want to be with me. Jesus has shown you what life can be like if you're with me. Okay, it's going to be fantastic. I mean, it's going to be like all the streets are paved with gold. It's going to be like these angelic choirs. It's going to be the best stereophonic music you have ever heard. It is going to be bliss. Trust me. It's where you want to be. That other place, what do I need to tell you to impart? That's not the place that you want to be. I'm not going to be there. It's going to be the worst existence you can imagine if I'm not going to be there. So I mentioned before that I would not have time. This has really gone over 90 minutes, which we try to limit the presentations to. But there was one question that I received via email this week, and it was a very good question. So I will take the time to answer this question. It comes from Stephen in Spring, Texas. And so I'll answer this, and then that will be the end of this presentation. So Stephen asks, why isn't string theory supported by a greater portion of scientists who otherwise trust the Big Bang model of creation? These are scientists who are either believers or skeptics. So Dr. Michael Strauss, who's a particle physicist and he's a professor of physics at the University of Oklahoma, he writes a really good blog for the layperson, and he wrote a blog referring to the death of string theory has been greatly exaggerated. And so he talks a little bit, he goes into depth a little bit about string theory, about what are some of its strengths and its weaknesses. One of the things that he said that I thought was very interesting, he said that string theory can reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity, and that was the whole point of the Elegant Universe DVD. But he adds this, so string theory can reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity, and it produces a calculable quantum theory of gravity in a way that naturally produces a graviton. That's the proposed quantum carrier of the gravitational force. This fact alone causes many scientists to believe that string theory most likely is true. Now, why would scientists not accept it? Well, if you watch the Elegant Universe DVD, they go to great lengths to help you to realize that string theory is just a theory. And one of the problems with the theory is that they're having a tremendous difficulty imagining how they can test it. So they question, is it a theory or is it a philosophy? If it's a scientific theory, then it should make predictions. We should be able to test those predictions. But the strings are so infinitesimally small, they're having a hard time figuring out, well, how do you test that? Dr. Strauss, who works at the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, he said that for us to be able to detect strings, it would require that we had a particle accelerator that was the size of our galaxy, not the solar system. The size of the Milky Way galaxy is how big it would have to be with current technology to be able to detect strings. However, scientists do think that there are some predictions of string theory that we still might be able to test in the coming years. One of the predictions of string theory is that if string theory is true, then the particles that we know of now would all have what are called partner particles. So an electron would have a partner particle called a selectron. A quark would have a partner particle called a squark. And so scientists thought that by the year 2010 that we would have enough power, enough energy to be able to smash particles in the LHC and detect the existence of the partner particles, and surely thought that we'd be able to do it by 2015. But that has not yet happened. There's been no hint yet of that. So some scientists think, well, it may not be true. There are other scientists who think, no, we're not quite there yet, but they think that within the next 15, maybe 20 years, that we will be able to collect enough data from the LHC to demonstrate whether string theory matches those predictions, those findings. And so there is still hope that string theory may be true. Now again, to reiterate the point, even if string theory one day is found to be demonstrably false, the concept we've discussed today could very much be true because they just simply require extra dimensionality. It doesn't require that the whole universe is made of strings. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I know that this was much longer. I really do appreciate your time and attention. I look forward to the day when we can meet together and do this in person. I would much rather present this to an audience full of people. It's so much easier to get that sort of feedback. Again, thank you for tuning in. And next month, remember that we'll have Dr. Brandon Riddell, who's the NASA scientist, talking to us about the International Space Station. Thank you very much.